Right, thank you very much. Unlike Andy, am an American, so I'm going to guess most of you will have no trouble hearing me because I tend to speak very loudly, so I do apologize for that. I'm going to give a talk that will bore probably half of the audience, so for that I apologize. One of these kind of methods talks. But in my defense, I will say that Raleigh did request this talk, so hopefully she sees something useful there in how we kind of put it together. So this talk kind of emerges from a really long paper. I think Andy actually helped comment on this paper, where we were really trying to grapple with a separate question in energy studies, which isn't the same as infrastructure studies, but I think many of the issues, looking at technology, looking at socio-technical systems, are kind of the same. And what we wanted to do is kind of bring attention to the importance of having basically good research and asking good questions, almost like a handbook for students. And I do think we have some students here. Can you raise your hand if you identify as a student? Okay, so yeah, a third of thank you, Andy. Thank you, student of life. We also wanted to kind of talk about what's in the title of the talk. What is novelty? When we talk about making research novel, what does that mean? We then wanted to talk very quickly about codes of practice for how to make our research more rigorous. And then finally, and perhaps most controversially, we wanted to talk about style. How do you do it well? How do you have a flair? How do you have your own voice? How do you communicate ideas? And I am cognizant, I wrote the article here with John Axon and Steve Sorrell. I know there is a lack of gender diversity among the authors, but I will retort, we at least do come from different disciplines. And you can notice a diversity of hair. So John has red hair, Steve has gray hair, and I have practically no hair. Thank you. Andy didn't even laugh at that. So the first kind of basic thing I wanted to come back to is it's very easy. Andy is an exception, but it's very easy for a lot of research to remain very obscure or very theoretical or only theoretical. And I wanted to put this up here to remind most of us that questions of infrastructure can also be very important in affecting the lives of everyday people. And I think very little research occupies this quadrant up here of what's been called the Pasteur quadrant of simultaneously advancing science, but also responding to social problems. We have a whole collection of research that's up here that's just applied. It meets commercial interests, but maybe doesn't have anything to do with science. We have the opposite down here, which is really focused on theories, but has really no practical use. Or we even have research here, which is so biased, it's meaningless, or so poorly designed, maybe by a student or maybe by somebody who wasn't trained, that it doesn't give reliable answers. And my very rough anecdotal take is maybe 90% of research is in these three quadrants, maybe 10% is in this very special spot of simultaneously advancing science and also addressing social problems. So I guess my first plea is try to be in the 10% that meets this dual mission rather than these other quadrants. And of course, really avoid the rubbish bin quadrant over there. The second thing I wanted to do, and even I fall into this, I write a lot of articles, and so does Andy, and even we forget the lessons, the kind of basic mechanics of how to write, maybe because we're rushed, or maybe because we have young children who are crying and you're trying to work, or maybe we fall sick. And so it is to kind of always do, it's kind of like a checklist. Every time you try to write research, try to state your aims and objectives, which are different than your research question. Make sure you have a research methods section. I'm still amazed about a third of articles in my field of energy studies don't. About half of articles in political science don't. They just kind of state, here's my thoughts and here's some references to support them. So you have no way of knowing how they collected their data, what biases and limitations they might have, how you might replicate the study, how you know it's valid or not, whether it considered other hypotheses. So I think all of that's very important. And then finally, I think this is also quite nice and relevant. John, Steve, and I really wrapped our heads about what types of research methods there are in our field. And by our field, I mean the broad field of social science on energy and climate, which I think you can put infrastructure studies close to. And we identified 7 different research designs. You have experiments and quasi-experiments, literature reviews, surveys, data analysis or statistical analysis, modeling, qualitative research, and case studies. Now, what's interesting is these 7 research designs kind of interrelate with Andy's nice little smorgasbord of different methods. Concepts are different than methods. I won't bother getting into that. But I'm not saying that like this list is different than Andy's. It's more like we're just coming at it from very different kind of vantage points. And what's interesting is you can see some of these different disciplines have very convergent notions of what is good research. Best example here is the experimental literature, behavioral economics, behavioral science, applied psychology, environmental psychology. You can tell what a good study is or a good study isn't by its effect size, by whether it did a randomized clinical trial or not. But there are other disciplines like multi-criteria decision making or qualitative research that are very, very divergent or very, very various. And there is no right way to do the research. And I would put infrastructure studies mostly into this category. So it's really challenging because it's very hard to agree, and anyone who's tried to go through the merciless peer review process can know that. It's very hard to agree on what is a good product. How did you answer the question in a way that everyone is convinced you did well? And Andy and I we encounter this all the time, especially when we have researchers from convergent disciplines that are trying to evaluate research. So that was kind of our big goal in this very long paper, was to kind of help articulate codes of practice to help you navigate those traps and hopefully convince a lot of the people who might be critical of your research. So what we do in the article, after talking about the basic mechanics and identifying with one of those 7 research designs, we do struggle with this notion of what is a novelty. And in my book, as an editor and author, novelty is maybe a third of the importance of a paper. Rigor is the other third, and style is maybe the third. So novelty is really central. And in fact, many times we tell PhD students their whole goal of a PhD is to be novel. It's to make a new contribution. But what does that mean? And so we try to kind of create a framework that better conceptualizes novelty, and we've kind of said, well, there are 3 types of novelty, lots of 3s in the article. There is, first of all, theoretical novelty. This is the hardest. This is creating your new theory. I've created a few, which no one likes. Andy has created a few, which are much more plausible and liked and popular. Examples here would be people who've created this thing called technological innovation systems, which can also apply to infrastructure studies. This is people like Marco Heckert, Anna Bergek, Stefan Jakobsen, or people like Elizabeth Shove, Harriet Bulkley, and others, Lorraine Whitmarsh, who've talked about social practices. In each of those situations, they created a new device to help understand energy, services, or technology. Social practice theory says if you want to understand energy, don't talk about the EVs or fuel cells, talk about the things we put energy to do, hot showers, cooking, and laundry. So it's a whole different way of understanding energy use in the home. That's very hard. What you can also do is maybe try to synthesize. So Frank Hales has a multi-level perspective, which is synthetic. It puts together about 8 or 9 other different approaches together. Or the one I like even better here is UTOTS, which I'm guessing you've never heard of. Comes from management studies and information science. It's the universal theory of the adoption and use of technology. They even put universal in the name of the theory. But what's interesting there is they did synthesize from 8 other theories. They had Asgen's theory of planned behavior, and Schwartz's norm activation model, and Rogers' diffusion of innovation. So they did take 8 theories and put them into one in a heuristic that's supposed to better understand how we adopt technology. And then the final one that I kind of like, because I'm not very good at inventing theories, is just testing them. What I've called theoretical triangulation. So you take the same topic or the same research question and you evaluate it through different theories. And the best example is someone that's even older than Andy, Graham Allison, who is writing way back in the 60s in the American Political Science Review, took the Cuban Missile Crisis and he then explained it through 3 different political approaches. I think realism, liberalism, and institutionalism. And in each of those cases, each of those different perspectives explained the phenomena. So that's really intriguing. What does it mean that we can have multiple theories that can all explain the same event? They're all right? They're all wrong? The second type of novelty, moving away from theory, is kind of methodology and methods in data collection. Andy had some excellent examples from STEPS up there, things like plural photo voice, right, and kind of open discussions. We like mixed methods. Many studies still use one method in isolation. We did a focus group. We did an interview. We did a literature review. But helping combine methods, we did an interview and then focus groups. Helps you triangulate between them, usually leads to better research, although also more expensive research. And still, I would say mixed or multi-method studies are probably fewer than 5% of what we see at one of the journals that I edit that gets a few thousand submissions a year. John and Steve sometimes identify as energy modelers, so they have a whole section on behavioral realism for models and how you input new data into agent-based models or integrated assessment models to make them more realistic. And then finally, you just have basically collecting data at different points in time. Again, 99% of research designs collect data once. Here's our survey from 2 months ago. Here's our focus group in January. Here's our household interviews from April. They don't go back to those respondents in May. Or you don't have a cross-sectional longitudinal panel that looked at data in 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021 with the same respondents. So that can be quite useful, and I've caught Ben Anderson's study down here, which may strike you as a bit boring, but he literally did collect 20 years of data on how people did laundry every week, right, across numbers of households to get a very fine-grained notion of what energy practices and laundry are and how they intersect. Some people apparently plan their whole day around laundry. I'm not one of those. And the final one is empirical novelty, and this is probably where a lot of studies sit. If you aren't able to make a conceptual contribution and you don't care about new methods, you don't have the training or the resources, new applications are certainly new cases. We've all seen electric vehicle studies done on Norway. What about Greenland, right? We've all seen studies about solar energy in Germany. Well, what about Argentina? So it's kind of looking at different countries that help give us a better picture of what's going on. I also like collecting, I think, data from hard-to-reach groups within ethics considerations, but children, victims, survivors, indigenous communities, and I'll have a slide about that in a second. And then, new forms of evidence as well, whether it's big data or telematics or using remote sensing. This down here on the right is a good example of a study that used remote sensing to estimate the production of oil from ISIL, or ISIS, and actually argued it was far less serious than groups like the CIA had said it was. So it was helping desecuritize the discussion about terrorism. And in terms of new applications, I quite like this one from Michael Horowitz, where he took the diffusion of innovations, which is a theory that many people have applied to air conditioners and washing machines, and he applied it to suicide terrorism, which in a way is an innovation, but that's kind of clever. He took it in a direction that most of us never would have thought, and apparently, according to Michael's work, it fits quite well at explaining suicide terrorism is an innovation that some groups adopt, and there are laggards and late adopters and people who kind of do it in different ways with different innovation styles. And this is just showing the kind of value of sometimes documenting from hard-to-reach groups, their lived experience or lived experiences with the technology. And so what this one on the right shows you is a young cobalt miner in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So the newness or the specialness of the research is simply going to the Congo to collect data and hear his story about mining and why it matters. And on the left, we really have a nuclear power show today, is me holding a dosimeter next to reactor number 4 at Chernobyl, which is showing quite unsafe levels of radiation. So I didn't stay for long. I also had to burn all of my clothes after that visit, by the way, because they're concerned about cesium dust. But visiting there allowed me, when people said, oh, Chernobyl is safe, then I can kind of show this image and say, well, I went there and it's not. So it's a kind of way of just documenting with different forms of evidence in empirical, novel ways an argument. Moving on, I know we're already a little bit behind, this notion of what is rigor. So if part of the research is being novel, the other part is making sure that you at least answer it, your question, right, in a thoughtful and careful way, or you answer it in a way that isn't, if not valid, it's better than somebody else could have done. How do you know that you've answered it in the best possible way? And in some disciplines, like I said earlier, disciplines like behavioral science, there are literally hierarchies of validity. There is a scale, and your study can sit on the scale. At the bottom of the scale would be people's experiences, or maybe a panel opinion of me and Andy and Tim if we were on a panel and gave thoughts. You can move up to, one pilot study, or you can move up to maybe a kind of one or more cohort studies, or you move up to one random controlled experiment. 2 is better than 1, and then always at the top for the medical sciences is the meta-analysis. And I can give you a really good example. What's a more reliable source of information? One doctor speaking to USA Today about COVID, or a meta-analysis of 112 countries over 24 months talking about COVID's progression, right, and how it diffused. Obviously, the second gives a more reliable answer than the first. And in some research communities, not infrastructure studies, but in some, it is as simple as try to move up to the top of the ladder to have a study that is more rigorous. However, what we say in the article is, well, you can't always move up the ladder if somebody else didn't do the studies at the lower rungs. If no one did the single case studies or the pilots or the single RCTs, then there's nothing to aggregate. So it's kind of someone has to do them. It often does require balance as well. No study usually excels across multiple ways of novelty or multiple ways of rigor. We wouldn't expect you, if you had a mixed method study that did interviews, content analysis, and maybe focus groups, to have like outstanding methods in all 3. You wouldn't need 1,000 interviews and 100 focus groups and 10,000 pages of content analysis. And it also differs really between disciplines. You can take a phenomenal study from Andy, but if you send it to the wrong journal, as sometimes we do, they may just desk reject it. Same if you sent a really quantitative study that said, here's the answer, here's our closed down answer, and you send it to somebody like Professor Sterling, and he's not going to agree, right? Because it's obscuring a lot of its assumptions. What we tell our students often is a kind of horses for courses mentality. This is a term I love in the UK. I didn't know it till I came here. It's right, certain horses do well in certain courses. Sometimes it's fit for purpose is the other term. And usually I tell people, don't always go up those different hierarchies of validity if you don't have the time or the training or the funding, right? Doing longitudinal studies, having representatively national surveys is expensive work. And sometimes there isn't a lot of value to moving up. A good example here is a survey designed well with a sample size of 1,032 respondents is just as good as a survey with 100,000 respondents if you knew how to sample appropriately. So spending all those extra resources to get more respondents doesn't make a difference if your original design isn't actually adequate. So to conclude, after this wonderful summary of methods, as tempting as that table I just showed is, and as tempting as it is to give you these tips about novelty and rigor and style, it isn't always so formulaic. You can still do everything right and not be successful, or do everything wrong and have your study be accepted. So I think it's also important to kind of think about these underlying principles, and there are 4 of them that serve you well independent of your research design or your research goals. So they're kind of more about styles of doing research. So the first one is definitely diversity, and I think I'm aligned here with Professor Sterling. Different intellectual perspectives matched together can lead to greater insights. Different theories, taking the multi-level perspective with social practices and trying to do it together, or taking maybe techno-economic paradigms and long waves and connecting it with, what does Johan do in deep transitions? With something else. Yeah. Can be really good. Or mixing different methods or mixing different cases. I think the second one is being more inclusive in terms of kind of different sectors that we analyze, infrastructure with energy, with climate, with health, or geographic inclusion, having authors from the north and the south, or disciplinary inclusion, having political scientists with anthropologists and sociologists and engineers. I think there's something to be said about creativity. Like I said, as formulaic as those things are, you can also have fun. You can try new things. I've seen poetry, I've seen song lyrics, I've seen cartoons in good research that sometimes works really, really well. Funny titles. Frank Hales just has one called Rage Against the Regime, right, which was kind of good, just like Rage Against the Machine. And then finally, actually there's 2 more. Being reflective, appreciating other people's work, recognizing the value of critical thinking, recognizing that you don't have a monopoly on the answer, and then finally humility, like I said, being modest, which is very hard for a lot of us, being humble, recognizing your own limitations, being explicit about them, being honest about that. I mean, I think these 5 principles will make you the type of a caliber of a researcher that shines above many of those who may not espouse many of those principles. And in the end, this is the last slide, try to have some fun as you put together research, because as Einstein said, if we knew what we were looking for, it wouldn't be called research. And with that, thank you very much.